Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bald Scald Musicology, where I am honored to welcome the very first guest here on the channel, an old friend of mine from our plague-ridden Peabody days at Peabody Conservatory, Anna Uribe-Law. Anna, would you like to say hi to everyone?
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. This is going
It's
to
an
be a
honor,
lot of
really.
fun. Oh, yeah. So,
Yeah.
Anna is a specialist in contemporary Latin American music, more specifically reggaeton, and we are going to get into more of that in a bit. But first off, Anna, how you doing?
I'm great. I have my coffee here, so
Yeah, you got the
I'm ready to do
stimulants.
this.
Anna was just telling me that she
Exactly.
spent the night at the airport. I'm assuming it was BWI if you're in Baltimore, and so she's a trooper for being on here right now.
Yes, well, that's why I have my coffee with me.
All right, awesome. So, Anna, how about you just tell us what you've been up to just pretty recently in musicology? Like, how are you keeping yourself busy lately since our Peabody days?
Well, we both graduated in 2021, right?
Hmm. Yep.
And since then, I've been working as a research assistant with RIPM, RIPM,
Hmm.
uh, retrospective. I always forget the long name
I never
for
say the
this,
full name.
which is embarrassing. I work there, but
Me too, and I
if my
can't.
bosses if my bosses are listening to this, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Ben.
Yeah, sorry, Ben. But so I've been working as a research assistant, kind of just cataloging and indexing Latin American journals from the 20th century, which is pretty cool because you get to read stuff that not a lot of people read or people forget that exist. And also there's just a ton of, news that people might never ever read again. And you're like, oh, cool. I have the honor to reading this and putting it in a long list of stuff that's happening within this journal. So I get to do that, and I also work on jazz journals, which for someone who's classically trained, jazz music to me is a little bit like a completely different world. And I remember when I was introduced to these journals, they were like, "Oh, you'll start to recognize names as as you go along." To this day, I'm still like, there's people that I don't know who they are.
Yeah,
That's
it's pretty
fine.
daunting.
So that's kind of what I've been doing right now. And yeah, just, figuring life as it comes because that's the life of a musicologist, kind of.
That's also just the life of being human. We just spend our whole lives figuring it out, and then when we get close, we die. But that's on the darker
Mhm.
side of existential crises. But I
Yeah,
wanted,
we don't need to go in there.
we don't have to go there. But I wanted to bring up, I agree with you. Probably the best part of working at Ripam is just you from reading those old journals and those old magazine articles and newspapers. You accumulate all of these pointless anecdotes that you can just
Oh, yes.
share for like fun stories. It could just be like something ridiculous, such as like when oh, who's the guy who did the documentary on jazz? Ken Burns. When Ken Burns' jazz documentary came out, and
Mhm.
I was doing the jazz journals for like Downbeat and stuff, and I got into that, and I had no idea like how much drama was around that, and then but then yeah, even more, you get all these little anecdotes and little historical perspectives that you're like, am I the only one who's ever going to read this?
Yeah, I remember with one journal from Argentina, I kind of discovered a all women quartet that was playing. You couldn't Google it. There's no record of them. Um, I don't think any other journal in the Ripon catalog had it. And I remember Nicoletta, she's one of the editors.
Mhm.
She was like, "Oh, it seems like you discovered a quartet." And I was like, "Wow, I feel important."
That's your breakthrough.
But yes, and then again, no, probably no one is gonna, look them up anyway. So
Oh, well, that's up
it's
to
fine.
you.
I did something.
Right now, someone is gonna dive into the depths of like musicology YouTube and hear you make this comment, and you just made their thesis.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I don't remember the name of this quartet
Oh, it's
to
all good.
whoever is deep diving.
sorry, sorry, future musicologist. Uh, yeah,
Yes.
awesome. So yeah, that's always a lot of fun working for Rip'em. It's just no shortage of like fun little things to learn over there. So Anna,
Hmm.
I would love to hear about your journey to becoming a musicologist because we were. Oh, sorry, the parrot's throwing a fit. Oh, he's fine. Uh, so I would love to hear your path to becoming a musicologist, since we were just a moment ago talking about how no one really knows what it is. So I'm always really curious as to how people get into this esoteric field of study, where usually we're into it before we know it has a name. So yeah, I would love to hear about how you like your journey to becoming a musicologist.
Yeah, well, quite literally the way you put it, we're kind of in it before we even know it has a name, which
Yep.
is, now that I think about it, that was me, kind of. I've always been well, I studied as a violinist. I did my undergrad, and I've been playing violin since I'm 4 or 5. So that has been my whole life, really. Um, then I've also been very passionate about history my whole life as well. So they kind of went parallel
Mhm.
to that point where, when you graduate, when you're gonna graduate high school, you're like, oh, what do I do now? That point in life where you're like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, but you have to make a choice when you're too young anyway.
You force teenagers
And
to make permanent life decisions.
exactly. So I was like, well, it could be history, but my violin, I feel like I can, do something with this. So I kind of left history to one side, focused on violin and stuff. And then obviously, with music and such, you have to go into music history classes, learn more about the context. And I was kind of like driven more so towards that at one point, especially if it's 20th century history. I'm like, yes, I'm here for it.
Awesome.
So when it came that time, like, oh, now I'm graduating from my undergrad, what am I gonna do now? I still don't know what I want to do. And I went to a music festival here in Texas, and I met people, and they were like, "Oh, you're graduating. What are you doing now?" And I was like, "I don't know. I don't know." And someone said to me, "Oh, like, have you heard of musicology? I feel like you could do that as your master's or something." And I was like, "Huh? What is this?" Terrible, I know. But I feel like that's some also a consequence of it not being talked about as much outside of its own, like niche.
Hmm.
So I kind of started looking, you Google, you're like, oh wow, musicology. This looks like so nerdy, so amazing. This is me. Um, so I was like, well, you know what? I'm gonna do this because also I had a friend who's a violinist and she had an injury. She couldn't play music, her violin, her viola, anything for like 6 months. And for me, that was like a revealing moment. It's like, I don't think I can only do one thing for the rest of my life because what if, you know, hopefully this never happens, but what if I'm in a situation where I can't play anymore
Hmm.
or, you know, something happens to my arms? I don't know, anything really. It could be anything. I don't want to be extremist, but
Yeah.
I'll just say my arms. So I was like, you know what? I think it's a safe choice to go into musicology. Eh,
Safe is a
big mistake
relative
there.
term.
Safe, well, I should clarify. Safe in the sense that I have more things to do
Hmm.
because I have my violin, now I'm going to go into musicology and I don't know what I want to do with musicology, but I'm sure that it might open up, some more areas for me to
Hmm.
become a well-rounded musician.
Oh, that was
So,
the Peabody buzzword. Well-rounded musician. You're
yes.
like, what the hell do you mean by that?
Hmm.
We just mean that you're well-rounded.
Yeah, to this day, I don't know exactly what it is, but I feel like what I was trying to do at that moment was kind of that
Yep.
in that direction. So that's kind of how I ended up in musicology.
Hmm.
And actually, I have no regrets.
Hell yeah.
Um, Sometimes I'm like, why am I doing this? And then, like you stumble upon something or you learn something, and it's like, well, yes, this is why I'm doing it. So,
Oh yeah, you just learn that new bit of historical information and all your dopamine goes off and you're like, all right, this is why I love this.
yeah.
Is yeah,
And
what
most
you
people
were
won't understand it.
Right.
But
What you were talking about was reminding me of even the, if you remember, the whole reason Liz Tolbert got into ethnomusicology was because she was the Chopin pianist, and then she
mhm,
like broke her wrist or something, and then she was like, well, now I might as well just study Chopin, and now she's like a world renowned ethnomusicologist all because she broke her wrist. So it's funny how that works.
yes,
You either choose to go into it or
you
you're
never
forced
know.
into it.
Yeah, kind of. But which kind of goes to say like, oh, it's like the saying of that people say that musicologists are the musicians that you know are not good or couldn't play something like that. I beg to differ.
Yep.
I beg
I
to
hate,
differ.
yeah, that's an old cliche that sort of needs to go out the window. It's one of
Yes.
those things where like musicologists know it's not true, but the joke still sticks around because the joke is funny. It is, right?
Yes, it is
And that
funny,
sort of gives it its staying power.
but that's about it. It's
Yeah,
just funny.
it's funny. Just like viola jokes, right? Like I'll always laugh at a good viola joke, but I prefer viola to violin. Uh, but I'll still laugh at the viola jokes 100%.
I'm biased. I'm biased. I'm
Oh, I know
always
you
gonna
are.
say violin.
Yeah. Yeah, so yes, that's very interesting that you brought up that you have these two simultaneous passions for history and music. And then
Mhm.
someone tells you what musicology is and you're like, oh, I'm gonna go look that up, and then you're like, oh, this is a dream come true for me, because that's sort of what happened for me too, right? Is I was
Mhm.
in that music after 1700 core curriculum course you have to take as a music student, and it wasn't until I was halfway through the term paper when I first heard the term musicology, and I was like, oh, there's a word for what I'm doing. Let me look this up, and I was like, oh, cool, my life calling. So you
Exactly. Yeah,
stumble on it.
suddenly everything made sense.
Yep. So so as a violinist, did you have a favorite type of repertoire, or what was your preferred, I don't know, way of playing violin? Did you prefer like solo stuff, orchestral stuff, experimental stuff?
I was fortunate enough to experience a lot of, different formats in playing. I would say my least favorite was solo because it's you have to have a certain personality for that. And for someone like me who's very introverted, being the center of attention and also so self-conscious and perfectionist, I cannot do that to
Hmm.
myself. But unfortunately, that's kind of what you have to start off as when you're a
Hmm.
performer, a musician. Um, Maybe my favorite would be chamber, I would say. Chamber music, I enjoyed it a lot. I had this great group. We were a piano trio and we would play just about anything. We also did gigs and we would play, like Frozen and Game of Thrones and I don't know what. And we had a
Hell yeah.
blast. And then we would also be playing Schumann and Arvo Pärt, all these,
Hmm.
we had a large spectrum of repertoire, which was really cool. Um, oh, and also definitely recording music for um composers in the sense of like music for for videos.
Hmm.
I forgot that word.
No, you're good.
That was also being in the studio for me was also very, very exciting because you get to create something with the
Yeah.
composers rather than just, oh, this is the music in a box and I have to play it like that. Sometimes it's fun, but sometimes you want to be more free. So
Oh yeah.
I like a lot of things.
Awesome.
Orchestral too, but I'm a nerd, I can just keep going and going and
Yeah.
I'll find something good to everything except being a soloist.
I love it because I feel the same way on the bass, right? Like my classically trained instrument is the bass, and every time I went up on the stage to
Hmm.
do a solo recital, I was like, the hell am I doing a solo recital on a double bass? Like the name of my instrument
Well,
comes from the fact that I'm just a deeper cello. But like, and then there's such a mid-range between like uh ensemble bassists and then those solo bassists that students have to look up to, like Edgar Meyer,
hmm
and of course I'm just gonna blank on all the names now, but you see people like that and they're shredding up a storm and you're like, that's not human. And it's just, yeah, and you're the center of attention on that stage and you're like, I don't want it. Can someone please come up here
Oh,
with me?
yeah, no, thank you. Too much spotlight on me, and no. I was gonna make a double bass joke, but I
Oh,
couldn't in the
please.
moment.
Because I also play banjo and there's no shortage of banjo jokes. So like, I'm used to being the butt of jokes. It's sort of a point of pride for bassists. That's actually why
Yes, yeah.
bassists and violists sort of get along, because we just sit in the corner like, hey, have you heard this joke? Yeah, someone told that one to me in the hallway.
Ah, that makes sense. Like when you're a violinist, you're top of the food chain, so
I
it's a
like the way you
different
put it.
perspective from up there.
You look down on the peasants in the rhythm section. No, I'm kidding. So
Not me, not me.
yeah, not you, not you. So Anna, let's get into talking about your area of interest as a musicologist. Now that we've sort of got an idea of like your background and how you got into this, um,
Hmm.
what are some like what is perhaps like one of the things that draws you to contemporary Latin American music the most, particularly reggaeton? Like, why is that, at least at the moment? Because we were talking about how musicologists' interests and fields of study sort of change over time. So at least at the moment, what is it about this particular music culture that sort of like grabs your attention, and what do you find interesting enough about it to pursue like research into it? I'd love to hear more about that, because that's a foreign music style to me, like literally and figuratively. I know very little about it.
Yeah, I just one thing, I want to make sure that the trash truck is not making a whole bunch
Oh
of noise
no,
right
I
now.
hear no trash truck.
Okay, great. It
Don't worry
might
about
get
it.
loud at one point, but
You've got the trash
sorry,
truck,
people.
I've got the parrot, don't worry about it.
Okay, we're good. Perfect combo. Let me see. Well, I guess there's a lot to say about it, really. For me, at least, it was purely by accident that I ended up doing this, really. Once I arrived to Peabody, I keep saying this, and people are like, how does this happen by accident? But there's a full story to it, kind of. When I arrived to Peabody, I was like, well, yeah, sure, musicology. I don't know what my area of interest specifically might be. I would always just say like, yeah, 20th century music. I like Russia. That's about it, very
Yep.
broad. And then once I started taking all these seminars, I somehow found myself being an advocate for Latin America because people don't usually talk about Latin American music in seminars. It's always
Mm-hmm.
like Western European.
Yep.
Um, and then maybe, sure, let's talk about American music, but we have to go through Western Europe first.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget Western Europe. And don't forget all these German composers. And it's like,
Especially at a
sure,
conservatory. Like,
exactly.
yeah.
Yes. So it's like, of course, this is all very interesting, but and especially in a conservatory where there's so many people from different places from around the world,
Mm-hmm.
especially Asia, I was like, well, it would be interesting to talk about more of all these different sounds that the world has to offer, just not, but this is
Yep.
this is a whole different subject. So I'm not gonna go into that. That is
Maybe for another time. Well, have you
yes,
back for a whole soapbox on that. I'll happily join in.
yes, yes, yes. So I just became very advocate for Latin American music, and more so, I found myself gravitating towards contemporary popular or pop, I should say, because that's also the music that I listen to the most,
Mm-hmm.
I'm your typical in between millennial Gen Z person who will listen to just everything that's mainstream right now. That's me. So, and obviously, with Latin American music like reggaeton and salsa, merengue, all these popular genres, you're listening to them constantly because that's like the music that's blasting at parties
Mm-hmm.
and on the radio, even at a tiny store that's trying to sell something, there's loud music blasting. Yes, that's Latin America for you. It's a party, constant party. So I was like, well, it would be interesting to keep talking about these things. And most of my, papers and such were about contemporary artists and whatnot. And then COVID hit. That was amazing. We all know how that went.
We had one wonderful
And when it
semester in person, and then
won,
three.
like 4 weeks.
I'm getting the shakes just thinking about it.
Oh no. Oh no. My whole life now is based off Zoom, really,
Oh no,
ever
well
since
sorry
2020.
sorry to lasso you back in.
That's fine. That's fine. And you know how it was popular to have a bubble of people to spend time with,
Hmm.
you know, like I have my bubble and that's it. So with my bubble of friends, we would, have small get-togethers, kind of parties to kind of feel like you have some sense of normality.
Hmm.
And we would, play reggaeton, because it's just a great genre for partying. And I started seeing how people would kind of react to it or dance to it, comment and such. And I was like, you know what? It would be really interesting to do like thesis paper on this. Why
Hmm.
not? I didn't know exactly how it was gonna come about, but I was like, it's gonna be something like this.
Hmm.
Of course, the backlash that I received from people was like, hmm, reggaeton, academia, that doesn't go too well together, you know?
Oh
Even most of
man. Hmm.
my friends who are like closer in age and, perspective to me, some of them were like, well, I'm not sure. Why don't you want to talk about, your other interests, classical music? And I was like, everyone has talked about everything that there has been said about all these amazing composers. Sure, I love them. I'm not gonna, you know, talk badly about them,
Hmm.
but there's only so much you can talk about certain people and their music.
Hmm.
And there's so many other genres that need this, like airtime, so to say.
I like that. I like
So,
that way of putting it. Yeah.
yeah. So I decided to do that. And it actually ended up being more of a ethnomusicology
Hmm.
focused paper. Um, because if you're looking at people, you're not really in music, you're really looking at the people rather than just the music itself.
Hmm.
And it's humans that make music. No one else really,
Yeah.
I mean, this is a whole other debate,
Yeah,
but
right.
I just realized I tricked myself. But it's really, mostly humans that make all these varieties of sounds, genres, whatever. So you're really just studying people.
Hmm.
So that's kind of how I ended up doing that. And obviously, as a Latina myself, it's very interesting to kind of see how this genre is understood outside of um, Latin America, because that's what my thesis actually ended up being was reggaeton in the US. Versus Latin America and how producers are kind of generating a generic sound, really,
Hmm.
and how that is sold or understood by Latinos in Latin America and non-Latinos in Latinos in the US. Oh my God, this is like a tongue twister. Latinos and non-Latinos in the US.
Yep.
So that's kind of it, how I ended up and why I'm doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. You brought up a few things I sort of want to latch on to, but the first one is, you brought up this interesting thing where, in the middle of sort of uh I'm going to use the word complaining, but not in a bad way because we are complaining about it. In the middle of complaining about sort of the immense emphasis that is put on very specific composers in academia, you sort of stopped to make the little footnote. This isn't about the composers. This is actually more about the system around the composers that sort of like puts them into a bubble and puts them above everyone else. And I get into this conversation all
Mm,
the time where whenever someone starts complaining about oh, music school is all about the German composers and the French composers. People are always like, oh, but if you don't like those composers, then why are you here? And then you sort of have to make the distinction like, I love the composers. The composers aren't the ones who are making the entire world learn about them 24/7 as like the
Yes.
standard of getting into music school, right? So I think you made a really beautifully put important distinction there between complaining or sort of let's say criticizing
Yes,
the
there you go.
structure. Yeah, the word was escaping me. Criticizing like the institutions around the composers versus criticizing the composers themselves. And I think that's a distinction that people need to talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, it's kind of like Shakespeare, you know. You have to study Shakespeare in school. I had to do that. And at least if you're in a English speaking school,
Mm-hmm.
you have to study Shakespeare. But Shakespeare didn't write his plays for them to be analyzed in English class and I don't know, sonnet form,
Yeah.
ABA, all these, things. Shakespeare wrote those plays for pure enjoyment of an audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of, very similar to music in general.
Mm-hmm.
Neither Bach or Beethoven or Debussy, I mean, no one wrote their music for it to be analyzed and, be looked in all the forms and ways that you could understand a sonata form. No, it's just music for pure enjoyment. So it's not their fault that their music or their plays or whatever is being studied that way. It's those institutions that want to kind of immortalize them and only them
Yep.
rather than kind of looking at a bigger scope of what there is around the world, really.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
feel like now in the 21st century, it's kind of changing, or more people, younger generations are kind of realizing that. But it's a huge task to undergo.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember you and I were usually on the same page with sort of having to criticize that focus because even though this is in entirely different scopes and different magnitudes and different historical contexts, like the drum I was always beating was that where are the Scandinavian composers, and I would
Hmm.
always have to remind people like when they're talking about Europe in general. Especially in those, that music and politics class we were both in, like when we refer to
Oof.
Europe in that context, like generally people are only talking about a few countries, and like I
You
just had,
can you can list them in
yeah,
one hand,
yeah, you
even.
can, right? And they're like, and so it was always crazy to me how little people knew about Scandinavia, like when it came to music. They'd be like, yeah, Grieg and Sibelius, that's it, right? It's like, nope. There's so much more.
Yes,
And
actually,
yeah.
actually, if you remember, I asked you when I had to give a seminar. I asked you for a composer,
I do remember this, you just sent
and
me back.
but here this I've actually made this a cool story to kind of emphasize on how important it is to expand these, the composers that we talk about.
Mhm.
And it was the fact that um all the other composers that I've talked about, everyone was like, yeah, cool, I've heard of them. Yeah, I kind of know this. And then this was like, wow, what is this? Can you send us the link to the it's not a song, oh my God. But just send us the link. We want to hear it. I'm gonna
Mhm.
search for more. I'm a violinist. I want to play this, blah blah blah. And I was like, this is why you should give, the students more repertoire, more music, more composers for them to explore other things.
Mhm.
And to everyone that I tell this story, they're like, yeah, that makes sense. I'm like, well, of course it does.
Yeah, because I think it's a beautiful example. Yeah, that was a la Bull, right? Was it?
Yes.
Yes, right, right. No, cool. Yeah, because yeah,
Hmm.
you just sent me back in time. I was like, whoa, I forgot about all this. No, but you're right. Like, I love talking about Alla Bull because he was right after Paganini, and everyone hears about Paganini and all
Hmm.
that. But at least in my opinion, and I know I am 110% biased here, I think Alla Bull is a much more interesting person than Paganini. And he was, and as you know, he had this whole history in the States and everything like that, as he was like a pop star. And
Hmm.
uh I love teaching students, just like you said, about these unexpected ones where, they go into a music history class saying, like, okay, we're going to learn about Mozart, and then we're probably going to go into Beethoven, and then we're probably going to go into Schubert, and then they just know what they're going to have to go through, and in that way you sort of take the I don't know, the element of sort of like enchantment, or maybe that's
Mm.
too melodramatic of a word, but this element of mystery you sort of take out of learning about music history. And then when all of a sudden you're learning
Mm.
about this crazy Norwegian guy who was just like shredding his own modified violin and was like going on and on about trolls and devils and stuff, everyone's like, whoa, hold the phone, who is this? And that's
Yeah,
a
rather
great
than
example of what happens if you just do that with any musicians from around the world. Shake things up, show these students that like the world is so much bigger than your typical history class leads you to believe it is. Yeah, thanks for reminding me about that. I'm so glad that Olive Bull made your teaching experience that much better, because that guy's crazy.
yeah, and also for me as a violinist, I was like, this is really cool. It
Mhm.
kind of also opened my own perspective because, of course, I've heard of Paganini 1,001 billion times. So to think that there were other amazing violinists at that time other than Paganini is like, well, of course, it makes sense. He was not the only violinist playing at that time, but he was so famous, or
Mhm.
there's this like legend around him that makes him so enthralling that that's it.
Yeah.
But Audible is also very enthralling and, has also amazing things to talk about. So we should talk about them.
Yeah, it's dude, it's so cool. I don't want to make this about Nordic music, so I'm gonna bring this back to your because I got a whole other platform for that. So let's bring it on back
Yes, yes, yes.
I would love to know sort of like what your topic was for your thesis, and for reggaeton. Like sort of how did that unfold? What were the main questions you were looking at with it, and sort of like how you're bringing that forward in your studies as a musicologist?
That's the question everyone wants to know. What I basically did was kind of compare, so to say,
Mm-hmm.
what music producers in Colombia, at least, because that's one of the up and coming centers of reggaeton right now, are creating a lifestyle genre around reggaeton,
Mm-hmm.
and how this is either replicated or, well, not replicated, but understood and consumed by audiences in the US. Because it's one thing of how people might listen to it in Latin America, within Latin America, and how other people in the US might listen to it because you have Latinos, you have non-Latinos. So that kind of expands the audience group, so to say. So I interviewed two composers from Colombia. I interviewed four people in the US, two Latinas, two non-Latinos, to kind of get a different sense of it. And it was really interesting to just talk with people about a genre, really, and kind of just understand their perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was probably the most fun.
Mm-hmm.
Having to transcribe them and translate them, not so much fun. But but having that conversation with people was amazing, and I kind of want to, keep doing that, really,
Mm-hmm.
just to get a better sense of this genre in the US. And then I just kind of compared them, try to understand how this genre is understood as a lifestyle
Mm-hmm.
here in the US. And it was really interesting how, at least for the Latinos, they understand it as a connection to their homeland.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it happens a lot that when people move here, they kind of try to separate themselves from their background because they want to fit in. There's this idea of what the US means or is to them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's usually their parents that are like, oh, this is the American dream and we have to fit in. So we're going to kind of just ignore our, heritage, our culture, everything, and just this is what we're doing.
Yep.
So for these kids, when they start listening to reggaeton, it's like, oh, here's a connection to my, my culture back home that I don't really get to connect with. And it's more accessible to them because it's artists that are kind of similar to in age to them. You know,
Hmm.
most of these reggaeton artists nowadays are young, and also it's what you're listening to on the radio. If you turn on the radio, you're gonna listen to Bad Bunny.
Yeah.
If you go on TikTok, it's probably gonna be Bad
Yeah.
Bunny, something like that. So, so it's very, very much accessible to them.
Hmm.
So it's just really interesting to see how they are kind of consuming it, and also how non-Latinos are listening to it because they also have access to radio, social media, all this. And but their perspective is different. Firstly, because they don't speak the language necessarily.
Yeah.
So a lot of it, which is obviously very hyper masculine,
Hmm.
and the objectification of women is lost to them.
Hmm.
Also, similar songs that might be more of like female empowerment or just feeling good, it's always lost to them. You just hear the beat, which is a very
Yeah.
steady doom, doom, doom. That's
Hmm.
it. So it just kind of is understood as a party, feel good, kind of cool vibes, and that's it. But once they're aware of the lyrics, they're like, oh, maybe I can't listen to this around everyone, but that's fine.
I have a good story for you. So, here in Boulder, Colorado, right? There's a huge Latino
Hmm.
population. Alyssa working in the bakery, all of the guys working in the kitchen are Latino, and they get the radio, they put it on. So that's what she listens to all day. And then, I'm right on a main street here, and so I hear it flying out of cars as they drive by, and I'm hearing it constantly to the point where I'm like, well, I feel like I've listened to it a lot. And then this hysterical thing happened where I was sitting in an Indian food restaurant, up on in like the student in the student part of town. And there
Hmm.
was reggaeton playing very loudly to the point where like I couldn't like order the food. They had to turn it down. But then when I
Cool.
was done, they turned it back up. And while I was waiting for my food, I was listening. I was like, this is a pretty sexually intense song that's just like blaring over the speaker while like a lot of different age groups are like eating curry. And I thought
Hmm.
that was like, I was sitting here like, this is a really interesting snapshot into like Boulder college culture right here. Because, the whole kitchen is like
Hmm.
college students. So just for that reason alone, I really hope that eventually you wind up in Boulder for at least a little bit. So because I think like this is a great place to look at how reggaeton is sort of disseminated and consumed by vastly different types of people. It's pretty interesting, but it's everywhere.
Yeah, that would be really cool because really the way I was trying to like understand it is how it's infiltrating
Mhm.
American culture or whatever you want to call American culture anyway.
Yep, that's a can of worms.
That's a whole other
Well, we've got
conversation.
like three or four more or conversations to have after this.
That is just to show you how amazing musicology, and musicology, whatever, can be. There's
Beautiful.
always something that you can talk about
Hmm.
and discuss and whatnot.
Yeah.
You're not just talking about one composer.
Hmm. Yeah. And then the other thing you brought up that was really interesting to me is when you were talking about how a lot of families they immigrate here and their parents sort of say like, no, we're in America now. All right. I don't want you guys to like stand out or whatever the other reasons are to wanting their children to sort of assimilate better. These are the same issues that like a lot of Euro descended Americans go through, except it's been on a much longer time frame where like I think it's like
Mhm.
it's because of all of the new wave of immigration issues and all that, where people are becoming more interested in ideas of like, where do I come from and how can I express that, right? And so now even white Americans like myself, I mean, the reason I'm so fascinated with like Nordic music and Celtic music is because like to me, like I grew up in a suburban hellscape, right? Like my culture was Target, McDonald's, going to the movie theater. That was my culture growing up. And I still remember the
The
very
American
first,
dream.
yeah, the American dream, right? And as soon as my mind opened up to like the idea of like, oh, our family came from somewhere else and all that, and suddenly like the world opens up, and now I'm like obsessed with it because it like, and I know you get into like weird conversations if you go down this road, but like it just speaks to you on a different personal level for some reason. If it's like completely made
Mhm.
up in my head or whatever, I feel like that's less important. What matters is like people love using music as a way to like reconnect to where they perceive, in my experience as a white guy, like where I perceive myself to come from. But in like more
Hmm.
contemporary immigration, like with more contemporary immigrants, like exactly, it's like we were just there like a few years ago. I can use this music to like go right back over there, and I find that so beautiful that people use music that way to just sort of
Hmm.
like I, take me back for a minute. Like that's all I want. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mentioned this because one of the persons that I interviewed, she talked about her family. She's first generation. Her parents immigrated to the US. So she remembers her parents being like, no, we have to listen to academic music, classical music. We have to, kind of assuming that this is what being cultured in the US is. We're going to speak in English because parents were learning English. We're just going to immerse ourselves in this culture and we're kind of going to put our heritage aside. So for her, it's like I get to reconnect with my culture through this. The other girl that I interviewed, she was like, reggaeton and these, like kind of urbano genres are a gateway for me to look into other Latin American genres. So it's not just like, I'm only going to listen to this genre. No, one thing will always lead you to another. That's kind of the beauty of music,
Mm-hmm.
really. So I don't want to say that all these people are just listening to reggaeton and that's it, and that's how they connect to their culture. No, there's
Right. Yeah.
always
Yeah.
something else that
Mm-hmm.
you can kind of connect to. One thing just might be the entry point, really.
Yeah, it's like, so I mean, like I'm always, I think that's a key place where your research and mine overlap, is just sort of like music and place, or music and
Hmm.
heritage and all that, because it's just like that is so fascinating how people use music to sort of like
Hmm.
explore that side of them that can't really be explained logically. It's almost entirely like just how, like intuition, like how I feel, right? Like even though I didn't grow up in the Appalachian Mountains, right? I grew up in, I just said, a suburban hellscape. When I'm out here in Colorado, I hear a banjo and I immediately think of my home back at like the foothills of Appalachia. It's just like the way that music just takes you back. It's just crazy. Um,
Mm.
yeah. So what were some of like the, I guess, what were some of the main takeaways, or like the key things you learned from the work that you've done so far? Let's say that some people listening here are like really interested in what you've found so far, so, or little nuggets that you can follow to go elsewhere. I would love to hear like some main takeaways from what you've done so far.
I think mostly doing this thesis for me was a confirmation of how big reggaeton is becoming in the US.
Hmm.
Sure, it's one thing to kind of see it, it's another thing to analyze, study it, go through the whole motion of this is what's happening and sitting down to think about it. Um, I think the biggest, the second biggest takeaway really was to understand how people might uh, understand this music differently, which I wasn't as aware of before. I was just like, oh, everyone must probably listen to it and think the same things. That I am understanding it too, because in a certain way, I am part of this group
Hmm.
of people, you know, in the US listening to reggaeton. But that is not true. And you only come to realize this once you've, had the opportunity to kind of talk to people and then analyze what they're saying, which sounds a little weird, but it's all for the cause of understanding music and humans, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's really that. It's really just understanding how a genre, and in this case, reggaeton, can be so influential, and a genre that people might overlook academically, really.
Party
So
music,
I
why do you
guess
have to
that's the
study
other
it?
takeaway. It's like someone saying, I'm going to study hip hop. Why do you want to do that? Because in 20 years' time, you're going to regret not having studied all these genres because
Because
they
someone else is
they
going to
will
do
go down in history.
it. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
either
there's that
someone else will
classism
do it or
aspect.
or someone or they will go down in history as something and there won't be enough information about it. So someone
Yeah.
has to start somewhere.
Yeah, that's why like this is one of the other, if we could like maybe we'll tie a knot on the on the critique, on the criticism, right? Is like there's this music happening every day all around us, and for a lot of reasons, I'm lucky, I'm very fortunate here at CU Boulder. They're actually incredibly open to studying this stuff. But I know that I like that is an exception, and elsewhere there's like more. So everything that I'm saying doesn't actually apply to where I am right now, which is why I picked this place, because it's like very very open and all that. But I know that typically, right, you do sort of like people sort of like give you that look where it's like, you want to study what? That's not serious.
Hmm.
That's not serious music, right? And I'm like right now I'm in a seminar on music of the 70s, right? And like that wouldn't have been a class anywhere else like 20 years ago. And we're looking at just how influential
Hmm.
like the counterculture and the hippie movement was just on America in general. And it's just like to think that people in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s were largely ignoring this part of music history because it was just a bunch of hippies. Like, oh, what are they really doing, right? And now we're looking back now in 2023, it's like, wow, there's a lot to learn from this time period. And I'm really looking
Yeah,
forward to seeing what everyone can learn from your work of poking and prodding at reggaeton as more than just party music, right?
of course. I don't remember exactly what university it's happening in, but there is someone who's decided to do a course on Bad Bunny.
Hell
And
yeah.
the backlash and, comments about why would you want to study Bad Bunny were immense. Of course, that's what you would expect, kind of. But then I was thinking, like, well, if you look at it from any which way, he's making history. He's doing things that a lot of other artists might not have thought of doing, but will do because of him now.
Hmm.
So even if it's, the music he's writing or singing or whatnot, or the way he's marketing his music, or the way he's presenting it, all these different things that you can kind of pick out, there is something to study and analyze. So someone has to do it. Someone has to start somewhere.
Yeah,
People are
because
just afraid of getting out of that box.
yeah, exactly. Like there's just so much to learn from just breaking down those walls and sort of seeing what we can learn from styles of music that haven't really been looked at. I face that all the time doing heavy metal, where I'm like, oh, this has probably been explored, and then someone's like, no one's looked at that before. I'm like, what? It's so obvious.
Yeah.
It's a low hanging fruit. You have, I brought up in the 70s class the other day that it's either the second or the third largest consumers of heavy metal. We talked about this, are in Latin America. And I had a lot of like classmates verbally go, what? It's like, yeah, dude. Like people don't know
Yes.
because it's not explored as much. Wow, my Maryland accent just came out really hard. I don't know, but but yeah, it's just these are the things that we can learn. Where it's sort of going back to the what happens when you keep studying the same people over and over again is you get diminishing returns on that aha moment. Like,
Exactly.
oh, there's this new thing
Hmm.
where like if you explore a new style of genre that's been ignored, you get that aha moment like every 3 seconds.
Yeah, you kind of lose that effect with composers that you've talked about for the last 100 years or
At least.
so. There's only so much aha you're
Yeah,
gonna
right.
get from that. But disco music, for example, 70s, 80s, which is this is another genre that has been frowned upon in so many different ways,
Hmm.
but it's amazing music, and that's what people at that time were, like enjoying the most. And I, for one, I love disco. I'm sorry for anyone who out there doesn't like disco. That's also another great, genre to talk about,
Yeah,
like any other, really.
yeah, that comes up
Metal.
yeah, that comes up in the 70s class all the time. We were just talking about funk the other day. We were just talking about like all
Mm,
the, as a bassist, that was my favorite day so far because that's like, what is funk? It's an attitude and a bass line. Like that's what it is. And so I was sitting there like, this is my time. But yeah, disco comes up all the
yeah,
time is like this genre that got ignored just because of the different stereotypes and associations that went around with it. But now that we're exploring it, people are like, wow, there's a whole history. Especially, I've got a guy in my class who's he specializes in queer music and especially the history of it in America, and he's the amount of
Mm.
stuff that he has to say that he's learned from just disco alone. Like, think of all the stories that are going to be able to be told and dug up that were buried under the rubble of, oh, it's not real music, it's not serious music, and now all those stories are maybe hopefully one day going to be able to be told, just like the stories with what reggaeton is doing for people all over the world, right?
Yeah, it's not serious music. Who cares? But
Yeah.
this is the music that's actually moving people nowadays.
Oh, whoa, we
So,
can't talk about music that makes people feel things, all right? That's outside the realm of
oh no.
academia, right?
Outrageous.
Yeah.
Outrageous.
Yeah, and I even felt a little dirty. I even just said, "Oh, it's more than just party music." And I want to correct myself and say, like, even if it is just party music, who gives a shit, right? Like, it's like
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
good, right? Like, anyway, Anna, I
The
you know
argument,
no, please go, please go.
the last thing,
Mhm.
the argument that I always say is that classical music at one point was popular music that people were entertaining themselves with,
And it was party
you
music.
know?
Like
And it was,
trios,
sure,
those trios you play, that was the party music in the salon.
exactly. Yes, like all this salon music that Chopin was playing on the piano. People weren't sitting in a concert hall listening to them. They were, chatting around in the room, talking, listening.
Drinking. It's
So,
just fraternizing.
drinking, yes, exactly. So, maybe in 100 years, the music that we listen to nowadays will be considered academic music, and classical music will be considered extinct or something. I
Yeah.
mean, not purely extinct, but it
Mhm.
will be like, what is this thing that's prehistoric, really? So it's just, it's a cycle. It's a cycle, but I really hope that academia kind of starts waking up sooner than later to all
Yeah,
these
it's
other
it's it's
amazing
getting there.
musics.
It's getting there, and hopefully it's the younger, it's the damn youngins that are gonna get us there. And what you just said reminded me of my favorite one liner from Futurama, is when Fry is listening to I think it was Ice T while he's sitting in his recreated 1990s apartment, and Leela goes, "Fry, turn off that classical music and do something with your life." And that line has always stuck to me because, like, yeah, in the year 3000, Ice T is classical. So, like, that's always stuck with me, and it's a great perspective.
Yeah,
So Anna,
yeah,
before
yeah.
before I let you go here, I was gonna ask you, like, what does musicology mean to you and all that? Like, what do you think it is? But I think we've talked about that enough. So instead, I would love to hear your, let's say someone's listening to this, and they're like, oh wait, I like musicology now that I know what it is. How, like, without without any pretense that you're going to lead people to success, what would you say to any, maybe young people or someone in undergrad right now who's trying to figure things out, and they're thinking, maybe I want to get into musicology? What sort of advice would you give to them, or what sort of experiences would you share that might help them along?
Ooh, I don't think I've ever had to think about this before, but
Surprise.
well, if I were to, if I could go back in time and tell myself something when I, started on this musicology journey, would be to not be afraid of going into it, even though I feel like I know nothing, especially as a performer. You have this in word, imposter syndrome.
Yep.
Oh,
Oh
wow.
yeah, very familiar
You
with that
have
one.
this sense, yes, yes. So for me, kind of going from performer to musicologist was a big kind of changing of mentality and everything. So I think the biggest advice I would be, no matter where you're coming from into musicology, is to not be afraid and just know that whatever you're gonna do, it's not like you're bound you only want to succeed. What matters the most is that you enjoy whatever you choose to study and that you're passionate about it. Because in the end, we're all doing something very, specific to one thing, and that will probably interest a small group of people, which is better than nothing.
Hmm.
So it's just about keep keep going, and the imposter syndrome might still be there, but it's it's just a reaction, I guess, to
Hmm.
what you're doing, but it's not true. It's not real. What's
Hmm.
real is what you're actually doing. So that would
Hell yeah.
probably be my advice.
Anna is beautiful. That resonates with me because you remember I retreated into being a butcher in New Hampshire for 2 years because I was like, no, I can't do it. I was like, nah, I'm a bad
Hmm.
student. I can't do it. And then after year two came around, and I was like, I kind of have to do that, don't I? It's just a nagging
Yeah.
feeling. It's like pulling at you, and it's
Hmm.
you and I are luckily we're on the end of it. We're like we're pretty glad that we made that jump out of the comfort zone and to sort of try to do something because that's sort of what
Yeah.
I hope that people take away is if you feel the urge to do something, you just go and do it, and then the other
Trust your gut.
trust your gut, and then the other thing you said that I thought is probably a really good note to end on is the imagery that I like to use to sort of complement what you're saying is that the musicality of humans is like a tapestry, right? And everyone has their own little
Hmm.
square of the quilt, a quilt, not a tapestry, a quilt, right? And so like everyone has their own little square of the quilt to add. And musicologists are sort of the ones that really sort of help put that little square of the quilt together. Because even if, and this also ties a little bow nicely on the conversation of academia, where like if you put too much focus on one square being the whole quilt, right, you miss out on all the other little beautiful squares of that quilt that would otherwise be in that space that you're taking up. And so that's why no matter how niche you
Yeah,
think your subject is, right? Like what's my niche, Anna? It's like neo-pagan Nordic music. How niche can you
exactly.
get, right? And I'm still somehow able to do it and I have no regrets. And it's just like it's just another beautiful square to the quilt that I'm proud to contribute to. And I'm really looking forward to the work that you're doing on reggaeton. That's going to be awesome too.
Yeah, we both have our own squares that might be on opposite ends of the quilt, but they're still something and they're contributing in a certain way to this whole thing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'd be two empty squares
Oh, I love it. Yeah, yeah. No
to
one wants empty
to
squares.
add to this poetry. To add to this poetry.
I love it. All right, Anna, it has been wonderful getting to talk to you again. It's every time I talk to you, I just get more and more mad at how time our Peabody was, at how soon our Peabody time was cut short. But
Oh
if you
God.
ever do get the chance to come on over here to Boulder, CU has their American Music Research Center, and they're always getting grants and everything. So hopefully someday you'll be able to come over and contribute to that. It'd be awesome. But Anna, is there anything else you'd like to say before we call today?
No, I mean, keep going to all my fellow musicologists. We're doing something, I hope. Something
we're all
good.
doing something good. Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah,
All right, cool.
hopefully.
Anna, where can do you have anywhere that people can find you if they want to sort of keep up to date on all things reggaeton or more from you?
Yes, well, there's two places you might find me. You can find me on Spotify only because I like making playlists.
Hell yeah.
So, if you need a playlist for any type of situation, I probably got you.
All right. That's
So
awesome.
that's my Spotify is Anna Spool. That's a little bit complicated
I'll link it.
to,
Don't worry about making sure
but it
people
will be
know how to
linked.
spell it from yeah.
It will be linked. And then my website, which also has a very long name, whatnot, but it will be linked. That's no
All right.
problem at all.
Cool.
And that's kind of where the stuff happens for now.
All right, awesome. Anna, thank you so much for giving me an hour on your Tuesday morning while after a night spent in the airport. Always love talking to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Please don't be a
Thank you,
stranger, all right?
Jameson. Yeah, it's always great to talk to you.
Yeah, always great. Okay, take care, Anna.
Okay, bye.